1457 BC, a young pharaoh stands before the most dangerous decision of his life. Ahead lies a narrow mountain pass, so tight that soldiers must march in single file. Chariots can barely move. There is no room to fight and no room to escape. If the enemy is waiting at the far end, the entire Egyptian army could be destroyed before the battle even begins. His generals warn him. They beg him to take the safe roads. They tell him a king should not gamble with the lives of thousands. But he refuses, because he understands something that many leaders forget. War is not only about strength. War is also about expectation, fear, and surprise. Sometimes the most dangerous move becomes the most powerful weapon. This is the story of the Battle of Megiddo, one of the oldest battles we can describe in detail, and often called the first recorded battle in history. And it begins with a rebellion that threatened to break Egypt's power in the north. Egypt, in the 15th century BC, was rising into an empire. The Nile River fed the land and made the kingdom rich. Grain filled storehouses, temples grew larger, trade expanded. Egypt's rulers saw themselves as chosen by the gods, and their neighbors knew Egypt could be unstoppable when it moved as one. But Egypt's power depended on more than the Nile. It depended on routes, roads and passes that carried wealth between continents. To the north lay the lands of Canaan, a corridor between Africa and Asia. Whoever controlled this corridor controlled commerce: copper, timber, horses, oil, luxury goods, and weapons. For decades, many Canaanite city-states paid tribute to Egypt. They sent gifts, soldiers, and obedience. But city kings do not like to bow forever. When Egypt's leadership changed, those kings sensed weakness. They believed Egypt would hesitate. They believed the new pharaoh might be untested, so they rebelled. The center of the uprising was Kadesh, a powerful city farther north. Its ruler helped unite nearby princes into a coalition. Together, they chose Megiddo as a meeting point, because Megiddo was a gate. It sat near crucial routes and had strong walls. If the coalition could hold Megiddo, they could block Egyptian armies from moving north. They could also send a message. Egypt's era of control was over. In Egypt, the new ruler was Thutmose III. Thutmose had spent years under the influence of Queen Hatshepsut. During that period, he was present, but not truly in command. Now he ruled alone, and he needed to prove that Egypt's strength did not depend on the past. It depended on him. So he chose war. He gathered an army, often estimated around 15 to 20,000 men, built for Bronze Age warfare. There was infantry with shields and spears, trained to hold lines. There were archers with composite bows, able to strike at distance. And there were chariots, the elite striking force of the age. A chariot team could move quickly across open ground, launch arrows, and crash into a weak point to break an enemy's order. In many battles, chariots did not just fight, they created panic. The march north took time. Armies in this era did not travel like modern forces. They carried supplies, animals, weapons, and camp equipment. They had to cross rivers, manage heat, and keep discipline. A long march could weaken an army before it ever met an enemy. Thutmose needed speed, but he also needed control. Too fast and the army could scatter. Too slow and the coalition would strengthen its defenses. Eventually, the Egyptians reached the region near Megiddo. Scouts reported the enemy coalition nearby. The coalition believed it was ready. It expected Egypt to approach by one of the safe routes. It believed the Egyptians would move like a predictable army, careful, cautious, and slow. But before the final approach, Thutmose faced a decision that would define the entire campaign. 3 routes led toward Megiddo. 2 routes were safer. They were wider, easier for chariots in large formations, and less risky for an army carrying supplies. They were also predictable. A coalition defending Megiddo would naturally place strong forces where an army was most likely to appear. The third route was different. It was the narrow pass near Aruna, a place of cliffs, tight turns, and limited space. An enemy ambush there could be fatal. If the coalition blocked the pass and attacked from above, the Egyptian army would be trapped in a long, thin column. Soldiers could not form proper lines. Chariots could not maneuver. Retreat would be impossible. It would be slaughter. The generals argued for safety, but Thutmose argued for surprise. He believed the coalition would not defend the most dangerous path strongly because it would not expect Egypt to risk it. He believed the coalition's attention was focused on the safe roads, and he believed that if Egypt arrived where the enemy did not expect it, the battle might be won before it truly began. So he chose the pass. Now imagine the march. Thousands of men moving into a narrow corridor. Footsteps, dust, the creak of leather, the rumble of chariot wheels struggling over rough ground. Archers looking upward at the hills, searching for movement. Scouts ahead, silent, tense, alert. Officers whispering commands. Soldiers thinking about ambushes they have heard of in stories. Hour after hour, the Egyptians moved through the pass in single file. If arrows came down from above, there would be nowhere to hide. If rocks rolled down, there would be no escape. This was the kind of decision that could destroy a kingdom's future in one afternoon. But the attack never came. When the Egyptians reached the far end, they realized something incredible. The pass was not defended in force. The coalition did not believe the pharaoh would dare it. The gamble worked. The Egyptian army emerged unexpectedly near Megiddo. The coalition's plans immediately began to collapse. Its troops had been positioned to face an enemy arriving from the safer routes. Now Egypt was in a different place, at a different time, with momentum and confidence. Thutmose acted quickly. He organized his army into divisions. He needed to strike before the coalition could recover from the shock. The Egyptians advanced and the fighting began. Archers opened the engagement, sending volleys to disrupt and frighten the coalition troops. In Bronze Age warfare, arrows were not only lethal, they were psychological. A storm of arrows could break morale, cause confusion, and force soldiers to raise shields instead of holding formation. Then came the chariots. Chariots moved fast across open ground, and when used well, they could turn a retreat into a rout. They could strike flanks, chase fleeing soldiers, and hunt leaders. The noise of hooves, wheels, shouting, and arrows could make an army feel like it was being crushed by a moving wall. The coalition line weakened. Some units tried to stand. Others stepped back. Then the retreat began, and once a retreat begins under pressure, it can become a disaster. Coalition soldiers ran toward the city. Leaders tried to regroup, but the shock of surprise combined with the speed of the Egyptian advance broke coordination. The Egyptians pushed forward. The coalition fled toward the gates of Megiddo. Victory looked close, but then a crucial moment changed the pace of the campaign. The Egyptian soldiers saw the abandoned enemy camp. They saw tents, supplies, weapons, and valuables. They saw gold and bronze, horses and chariots. The temptation was immediate. After weeks of marching, danger, and discipline, the reward was finally visible. They began to loot. That decision, whether driven by greed, exhaustion, or simple human nature, gave the coalition time to escape into the city. The gates shut. Leaders who might have been captured now hid behind stone and wood. The battle became a siege. Thutmose could not simply walk away. Leaving Megiddo unconquered would allow rebellion to continue. It would allow coalition leaders to claim they survived and resisted. It would weaken Egypt's authority across the region. So Thutmose surrounded the city. Siege warfare in the Bronze Age was slow and harsh. Rather than immediate assaults, armies often relied on starvation and isolation. Thutmose's forces built fortifications around Megiddo, an encircling barrier to cut off supplies and escape. The goal was simple: make time itself a weapon. Inside Megiddo, fear grew. Food became scarce. Morale fell. The coalition rulers realized their alliance could not last forever under hunger. Each day of siege weakened them, while Egypt remained outside with resources and control. Month after month, the pressure increased. Eventually, Megiddo surrendered. The coalition rulers bowed before Thutmose. Tribute was restored. Hostages were taken to guarantee obedience. The rebellion was broken, and Egypt's dominance in Canaan was secured again. But Megiddo matters for another reason. The campaign was recorded. The events were carved into the walls of the Temple of Karnak. For the ancient world, this was more than propaganda. It was detail. Rotes, decisions, spoils, and outcomes. It offered something rare, a window into strategy. That is why Megiddo is often called the first recorded battle. Not because earlier conflicts never happened, but because here we can follow the story with unusual clarity. We can see the choice of roads. We can see the risk. We can see the mistake of looting too early. And we can see how victory still required patience and control. After Megiddo, Thutmose III launched more campaigns. He expanded Egypt's reach, strengthened trade routes, and built a reputation as a warrior king. Over time, Egypt became the leading power in the region for generations. And the lessons of Megiddo did not die with the Bronze Age. Surprise can defeat preparation, speed can break alliances. Bold leadership can change the course of a war, but discipline must continue after the first victory, because one moment of distraction can turn a triumph into a long struggle. At Megiddo, history was not only made, it was recorded. A narrow pass, a bold gamble, a battle that became a blueprint. And from that moment forward, war would no longer be only legend. It would be strategy, remembered, studied, and repeated. Before we end, consider what could have happened if the gamble failed. If the coalition had placed even a small force inside the pass, the outcome might have been catastrophic. A few hundred men positioned on high ground could have turned the Egyptian column into a trapped line of targets. Arrows from above, stones rolling down the slopes, blocked chariots, soldiers unable to form ranks, panic spreading from the front to the rear. The army might have collapsed without ever reaching Megiddo. Egypt's prestige would have shattered, and every city in Canaan would have risen in open rebellion. That is why Thutmose's decision is remembered. It was not simply bravery, it was calculation. He understood the enemy's expectations. He understood that fear itself shapes planning. The coalition expected a careful pharaoh. Thutmose became the opposite. The same idea appears again and again in history. Great commanders attack where the enemy least expects, not always where the map looks easiest. They force opponents to react instead of prepare. They turn time into pressure and pressure into mistakes. Megiddo also reveals another timeless truth. Winning the battle is not the same as finishing the war. The Egyptians broke the coalition in open fighting, but their early looting changed the campaign into a long siege. That single lapse of discipline shows how fragile victory can be. 1 hour of greed can add months of suffering. One moment of distraction can let leaders escape, regroup, and resist. So when you look at Megiddo, you see two sides of leadership: the boldness to risk everything for surprise, and the discipline to continue after the first success, when emotions rise and rewards appear. Thutmose III had both. He took the risk, won the field, surrounded the city, and forced surrender. That combination, courage, speed, and patience, built empires. And it is why, more than 3,000 years later, this battle still speaks to us. Because Megiddo is not only an ancient story, it is the moment warfare became something you could analyze. A moment where decisions mattered as much as weapons. A moment where history began to record not just who fought, but how they fought. And it all began with a young pharaoh choosing the road that everyone feared.